The private wing of the hospital carried a silence so polished it almost gleamed, the kind of silence purchased at extraordinary cost yet powerless against fear. 12-year-old Adrian Volkov lay motionless beneath crisp white sheets, his dark hair damp against his forehead, his skin pale except for the faint bluish rash climbing like spilled ink along his collarbone. Outside the glass walls, the city pulsed with life, traffic lights blinking, skyscrapers shimmering. But inside this room, time had thickened into something heavy and merciless. Adrian was the only son of Viktor Volkov, a self-made billionaire whose name crowned technology towers and philanthropic foundations alike. A man accustomed to solving problems with precision and speed. For 3 relentless weeks, 17 renowned doctors had passed through this room, summoned from elite institutions across continents, their reputations forged in breakthroughs and impossible recoveries. They arrived with tailored suits beneath lab coats, with assistants carrying tablets full of scans, with confidence sharpened by decades of success. They studied MRI images glowing in ghostly blues, debated rare inflammatory syndromes in low, urgent voices, adjusted medications by fractions of milligrams, and ordered exotic tests flown overnight from specialized laboratories. Yet Adrian's condition refused to yield. His fever rose unpredictably like a cruel tide. His breathing faltered without warning, and the rash deepened in color each day, defying antibiotics, antivirals, steroids, every weapon in modern medicine's arsenal. Blood panels returned maddeningly normal. Autoimmune screens whispered no clues. Cultures grew nothing. The machines surrounding his bed hummed in indifferent rhythm, tracking heart rate, oxygen saturation, blood pressure, numbers flickering like coded messages no one could decipher. Victor stood at the window each night long after the specialists had gone. His usually immaculate suits wrinkled, his reflection hollow-eyed against the glass. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers before breakfast, faced hostile takeovers without flinching, built empires from algorithms and instinct. Yet here he was stripped of influence, unable to bargain with whatever invisible adversary held his son captive. Nurses moved gently through the room, respectful of the fortune attached to the boy but more aware of the fragility beneath it. The private suite boasted filtered air systems, imported orchids arranged in perfect symmetry, discreet security outside the door, even an automated scent diffuser installed to keep the atmosphere pleasant and calming. It released a fine, nearly invisible mist at programmed intervals, a soft hiss followed by a faint floral trace so subtle it barely registered. On the 4th Sunday of Adrian's hospitalization, rain traced silver veins down the tall windows as a small group of hospital volunteers arrived to deliver books and handmade cards to pediatric patients. Among them was a 9-year-old girl named Mira, her braids slightly uneven, her backpack stitched with bright cartoon animals, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. She had insisted on coming because her older brother had once spent months in a hospital after an accident, and she remembered how lonely the days had felt despite the best medical care. Security hesitated at the private wing, but a distracted nurse juggling medication schedules allowed the volunteers a brief pass to leave cards at doorways. Mira stepped into Adrian's room quietly, clutching a drawing of a crooked yellow sun with exaggerated rays stretching across the page. She noticed the machines first, then the pale boy in the bed, then the orchids drooping ever so slightly in their crystal vase. Unlike the specialists who saw data and diagnoses, Mira saw patterns. She stood near the foot of the bed, listening. A soft hiss broke the stillness. She glanced toward the wall just as the diffuser released its delicate mist. At that exact moment, Adrian's fingers twitched, barely perceptible. But there, his jaw tightened, the monitor registering a subtle spike in heart rate. Mira frowned, her gaze flicking from the device to the rash along his collarbone, which looked darker somehow, angrier. She waited. Minutes passed. Another hiss, another tremor. It reminded her of how her brother used to cough whenever their aunt wore strong perfume at family gatherings. Adults had dismissed it as imagination until a doctor confirmed a fragrance sensitivity. Mira stepped closer to the wall, peering at the sleek white device. "Why does that spray near him?" she asked softly, her voice almost swallowed by the hum of machines. The nurse adjusting Adrian's barely looked up. It's a hypoallergenic air freshener. Keeps the room comfortable. Mira hesitated, then pointed. But he moves when it sprays. Like it hurts. Something in her tone, earnest, observant, unafraid, made the nurse pause. She watched carefully this time. The hiss came again. Adrian's pulse flickered upward. The rash seemed to flush deeper blue at its edges. The nurse's brow furrowed. She crossed the room and unplugged the diffuser, the click sounding louder than expected. They waited in cautious silence. 20 minutes passed, then 40. Adrian's breathing steadied incrementally, his oxygen saturation improving by a small but undeniable margin. The fever reading dipped by half a degree. It was subtle, but after weeks of stagnation, subtle felt seismic. When the attending physician returned, the nurse relayed the observation, including the little girl's comment. At first, skepticism clouded his expression. Every product in the private wing had been certified safe, hypoallergenic, hospital-approved. But desperation humbles even the most confident minds. He ordered the device removed entirely and requested the ingredient list from maintenance. Among the compounds was a rare botanical extract derived from an exotic flowering plant, considered harmless to the majority but documented in obscure case studies to trigger severe reactions in individuals with an extremely uncommon sensitivity. So rare it wasn't included in standard allergy panels. Blood was drawn again, this time targeting that single compound. As rain continued to thread down the windows and the city lights flickered on against the darkening sky, the results returned. Positive. Adrian wasn't succumbing to a mysterious, untreatable illness. He was reacting to the very environment designed to soothe him. The room meant to comfort him had been quietly poisoning him in delicate, perfumed intervals. Victor watched as the numbers on the monitor stabilized further, hope blooming cautiously in his chest for the first time in weeks. When he learned that the turning point began with a child noticing a pattern no expert had considered, something inside him shifted. He stepped into the corridor where Mira sat swinging her legs, unaware of the magnitude of what she had done, kneeling before her, not as a billionaire, not as a titan of industry, but simply as a father. He asked gently, "How did you see what we missed?" Mira shrugged, hugging her backpack. "I just listened," she said. "Sometimes grown-ups look too hard at big things and forget to watch the small ones." In that immaculate hallway lined with credentials and accomplishments, the smallest voice had carried the greatest clarity, and the quiet hiss no one thought to question had nearly cost a life until a little girl dared to notice it. By the next morning, the atmosphere in the private wing had shifted so subtly that only those who had lived inside its tension could feel it, like the first warm current beneath winter ice, cautious and fragile yet undeniably real. The diffuser was gone, the orchids removed, every scented cleaning agent replaced with sterile, unscented alternatives, and for the first time in weeks Adrian's monitors displayed numbers that did not provoke whispered consultations. His fever continued to fall in steady increments, no longer spiking like a cruel clockwork ritual, and the angry bluish rash along his collarbone began to fade at the edges, retreating as if embarrassed to have been exposed. 17 doctors who had once filled the corridor with confident strides now gathered in quieter clusters, reviewing charts not with frustration but with dawning humility. They had chased zebras through textbooks of rare diseases, debated experimental therapies, and prepared for invasive procedures, all while the true culprit released its delicate mist at measured intervals above the boy's bed. Viktor Volkov had not slept, yet exhaustion felt different now. It was no longer the suffocating fatigue of helplessness but the trembling aftermath of almost losing everything. He stood beside Adrian's bed as dawn filtered pale gold through the tall windows, watching his son's eyelids flutter for the first time in days with something resembling natural rest rather than drugged sedation. When Adrian's eyes finally opened fully, confusion flickered there, followed by recognition, and Victor felt his composure fracture in a way no boardroom battle had ever managed. He gripped his son's hand carefully, afraid even hope might be too heavy, and whispered his name as though anchoring him back to the world. Nurses exchanged relieved glances, their professional calm softening into smiles they could no longer suppress. The attending physician explained the confirmed sensitivity to the botanical compound, citing obscure medical journals few had thought relevant. acknowledging with measured candor that without the environmental trigger removed, Adrian's condition would likely have continued to deteriorate despite every advanced intervention. The revelation moved through the hospital like electricity. Protocol committees were convened that very afternoon. Maintenance logs were audited. Suppliers were contacted. It became painfully clear that the private wing, designed for comfort and exclusivity, had introduced variables never present in standard pediatric units. Comfort had masqueraded as care. Meanwhile, Mira returned home unaware that her simple observation had ignited institutional reform. She told her mother only that the boy looked less sick when the spray thing stopped. 2 days later, Victor requested to meet her properly. When Mira and her parents arrived, they seemed almost intimidated by the marble lobby and discreet security presence, her mother apologizing repeatedly if her daughter had interfered with medical professionals. Victor interrupted gently, his voice steady but thick with sincerity, explaining in plain terms how Myra's attentiveness had redirected 17 experts toward the truth. He offered gratitude first, not money, though resources followed naturally. Education funds, healthcare coverage, opportunities he could provide without effort. Mira listened, swinging her legs slightly in the oversized chair, then asked the only question that mattered to her. "Is he okay now?" Victor nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Because you noticed something small," he said. She considered this thoughtfully before replying. "It wasn't small. It was loud. No one was just listening." Her words lingered long after the meeting ended. Within a week, Adrian was sitting upright, color returning to his face, appetite cautiously reawakening. Physical therapists visited to rebuild strength lost during weeks of decline, and each step he managed felt like reclaiming stolen ground. The 17 doctors visited not as distant authorities but as collaborators in his recovery, their conversations less defensive now, more curious. They discussed environmental medicine, rare sensitivities, the psychology of assumption. Some admitted privately that prestige can narrow vision, that when surrounded by cutting-edge equipment and complex data, the mind instinctively seeks complex answers. A child, unburdened by ego or expectation, had observed pure cause and effect. The hospital administration announced sweeping changes: elimination of all non-essential environmental additives in patient areas, mandatory environmental reviews in unexplained cases, and a new initiative encouraging staff to document and evaluate observations from anyone: family members, custodial staff, even visiting volunteers. They named the initiative the Listening Protocol. Though only a few insiders knew its inspiration, Adrian asked repeatedly about the girl with the sun drawing. So Mira visited again, this time welcomed warmly by nurses who had once hurried past her. She brought another picture, this one of a boy standing under a bright sky without clouds. Adrian laughed weakly, telling her she was better than all the doctors, which prompted immediate protest from a nearby physician who knelt and said, smiling, "We needed her help." The dynamic in the room had transformed. Authority no longer felt threatened by simplicity but enriched by it. Victor observed these interactions with quiet introspection. He had built his empire on innovation, on challenging assumptions within technology markets. Yet in his personal crisis he had deferred unquestioningly to expertise without encouraging broader observation. He realized that true leadership was not about commanding answers but creating space for questions from every level. One evening, standing again before the vast windows of his penthouse overlooking the restless city, he reflected on how close he had come to irreversible loss because everyone in that pristine room believed the environment itself was beyond scrutiny. 17 brilliant minds had not failed from incompetence but from certainty. The smallest visitor had succeeded because she possessed none. Adrian's full recovery became evident within a month, his strength returning, his laughter echoing once more through rooms that had nearly known only grief. On the day he was officially discharged, hospital staff lined the corridor not out of obligation to a wealthy benefactor but out of genuine relief and respect. Mira stood near the end, clutching her backpack, and Adrian walked slowly toward her before turning back to look at the room that had both endangered and healed him. Victor thanked each doctor personally, his gratitude sincere and untainted by resentment. Expertise saved him, he acknowledged, but humility guided it. The experience reshaped more than hospital policy. It reshaped a father's understanding of power. Wealth could summon 17 specialists in hours, could secure the finest equipment and private suites, but it could not purchase the clarity that comes from simple attention. That clarity had arrived in the form of a 9-year-old girl who listened to a soft hiss in the air and trusted what she saw. And long after the monitors were disconnected and the room reassigned, the lesson endured within every corridor of that hospital. Never assume safety simply because it is labeled so, never dismiss a question because it comes from a small voice, and never forget that sometimes the difference between life and loss is not hidden in complexity but waiting quietly in the details everyone else has learned to ignore.